Imagine waking up before sunrise, pulling on armor that weighs more than a grown man, and marching into a wall of fog so thick you cannot see the soldier in front of you. Now imagine that somewhere above you, hidden in that same fog, thousands of enemy warriors are lying perfectly still, watching your every step, waiting for one signal to come crashing down on your head. That is exactly what happened to a Roman army of nearly 30,000 men on a spring morning over 2,000 years ago. Within 3 hours, most of them would be dead. Not because they were weak, not because they fought badly, but because one man understood the human mind better than he understood the sword.
That man was Hannibal Barca, a general from the North African city of Carthage, and what he pulled off that morning beside an Italian lake called Trasimene is still taught in military academies today as one of the most perfectly executed ambushes in the history of warfare. To understand how an entire army could march willingly into its own grave, you first have to understand the man who built the trap. Because this was never really a story about weapons. It was a story about patience, pride, and knowing exactly which buttons to press on your enemy. By the year 217 before Christ, Hannibal was already the most feared name across the Mediterranean world. Carthage and Rome had already fought one brutal war, and Carthage had lost badly. Hannibal grew up in the shadow of that humiliation, and legend says that as a boy, he swore an oath at an altar to be Rome's enemy for as long as he lived. Whether that story is true or not, the way he lived his entire life certainly suggests he meant it. The previous year, he had done something nobody thought was possible, marching an entire army, including war elephants, straight over the frozen, snow-buried peaks of the Alps in autumn, losing thousands of men to cold and cliffs along the way.
The soldiers who survived that crossing came down into Italy, hardened, loyal, and utterly convinced their commander could achieve the impossible. This was not one uniform national army the way Rome fielded. It was a patchwork of different peoples, each bringing a unique skill to the table. Tough infantry from Spain and North Africa who could hold a line in close combat. Celtic warriors from northern Italy who simply hated Rome enough to fight for anyone against it. Deadly slingers from the Balearic Islands. And above all, Numidian horsemen who rode without saddles or bridles and could strike and vanish before anyone even understood what had happened.
Hannibal had already crushed 2 Roman armies before Trasimene even began. First at a river called the Trebia, luring hungry soldiers across freezing water and hitting them from a hidden flank. Notice the pattern forming here, because it matters. Hannibal never simply wanted to win a fight. He wanted to trap his enemy in a position where courage no longer mattered, where bravery could not save them no matter how hard they fought. Ordinary generals relied on brute force. Hannibal preferred to let his enemies defeat themselves through their own mistakes. And that preference is exactly what set the stage for the disaster to come. Rome, shaken but far from broken, elected a new consul that year named Gaius Flaminius. He was not from the old aristocratic families that usually ran the Republic. He was a self-made man, popular with ordinary soldiers, aggressive, impatient, and just a little too confident in his own judgment. He believed previous Roman commanders had been cowardly, and he was certain the only way to deal with Hannibal was to march straight at him and crush him in an open fight. That single belief, that stubborn certainty, was precisely the weakness Hannibal had been waiting to exploit,
and he built his entire plan around it.
Flaminius took up position at a town blocking the road south, and on paper, his plan was sound. A disciplined Roman army sitting on the route to the capital should have been nearly impossible to slip past. But Hannibal had no intention of attacking that position directly. Instead, he led his men through miles of flooded, disease-ridden marshland, terrain so miserable that soldiers could not even lie down to sleep and were forced to rest on top of dead pack animals just to keep their heads above the water. Hannibal himself caught an infection in that swamp that cost him the sight in one eye for the rest of his life, a heavy price paid simply to get behind his enemy unseen.
When his exhausted army finally emerged from the marshes, he had done exactly what he set out to do. He was now behind Flaminius, standing between the Roman army and the road to Rome itself. But instead of offering battle, Hannibal did something far crueler and far smarter. He marched south and began burning everything in sight, torching farms, looting villages, destroying the property of Rome's allies, all of it in plain view of the watching Roman army. The message could not have been clearer. Your general is too frightened to stop me, and he is letting your homes burn while he hides.
That calculated insult worked exactly as intended. Flaminius's officers urged patience, wanting to wait for reinforcements so the two Roman armies could combine their strength and overwhelm Hannibal together. That was the wise move, the safe move. But Flaminius could not stomach the humiliation of sitting still while his countryside burned and his enemy mocked him openly. His pride overruled his judgment, and he ordered his army to break camp immediately and chase Hannibal down, convinced that victory was waiting just up the road. He had no idea he was walking directly into the exact spot Hannibal had already chosen for him weeks in advance. The terrain Hannibal picked was almost unfair in its perfection. The road ran along the edge of a wide, shallow lake, and at one stretch, steep wooded hills pressed in so close to the water that only a narrow strip of flat ground remained, like a corridor with the lake on one side and rising slopes on the other. Any army marching through it would be forced into a long, thin, defenseless column with no room to form proper battle lines and water waiting behind them if they were pushed backward. Hannibal looked at that stretch of land and saw a finished killing field, needing only soldiers to fill it. So on the night before the battle, he arranged his men with the precision of someone setting a trap for a wild animal. He placed his heaviest, most reliable veteran infantry visibly on the high ground at the far end of the corridor, acting as bait and as the cork sealing the far exit. Then he hid the rest of his army along the hillsides overlooking the road itself, light infantry and javelin throwers tucked among the trees, and his devastating cavalry positioned near the entrance, completely out of sight. Every soldier understood his role perfectly. Nobody was to move, nobody was to make a sound until the signal was given. It was less a battlefield than a trap being quietly loaded, waiting only for the right footsteps to walk across it. The morning the Romans marched in could not have been more perfect for Hannibal if he had ordered the weather himself. A thick fog rolled across the lake and the low ground, blurring everything more than a few feet away, while up on the hills, the air stayed clear enough for Hannibal's men to watch the entire Roman column moving blindly below. Flaminius, desperate to catch up with Hannibal, had pushed his army straight into that narrow corridor without bothering to scout the high ground first, assuming his enemy was simply somewhere ahead on the road. He had no idea the slopes on his left were already
packed with thousands of soldiers, staring silently down at the back of his neck.
The moment Hannibal judged that the bulk of the Roman column was fully inside the corridor, sealed in from behind and blocked ahead, he gave the signal. And what followed felt less like a battle and more like an avalanche. His hidden troops came screaming down out of the fog into the exposed flank of the Roman line all at once, catching soldiers with weapons still slung and no formation to speak of. There was no time to do the one thing Roman soldiers were famous for, forming tight, disciplined ranks, because nobody could see far enough to even find their own unit in the chaos. The most feared infantry in the ancient world was reduced within minutes to a panicking, disoriented crowd trapped between hostile hills and a rising lake.
Flaminius himself fought desperately to rally his men before he was cut down in the fighting. And once their commander fell, whatever order remained in the Roman ranks completely collapsed. Some soldiers were pinned helplessly against the steep hillside with nowhere to climb, while others were pushed backward step by step until the ground simply ran out beneath them and the lake waited at their backs. Weighed down by heavy bronze and iron armor, they waded into the water anyway, and men in full battle gear do not float, so they sank and drowned in the shallows, while enemy horsemen rode along the shoreline, finishing off anyone still within reach. By the time the fog finally lifted, around 15,000 Romans lay dead, and 6,000 more had been taken prisoner, while Hannibal had lost only a fraction of that number.
What makes this victory so remarkable is not that Hannibal had better weapons or stronger soldiers, because he had neither. He won because he understood the ground beneath his enemy's feet, the weather rolling off the lake, and above all, the exact psychology of the man he was hunting. He knew Flaminius was proud and impatient, so he deliberately provoked that pride by burning the countryside in plain sight. He chose terrain that made Roman discipline completely useless, because you cannot form perfect ranks in a place with no room to form them at all. Every single piece of the plan was arranged so carefully that the outcome of the battle was already decided long before the first sword was ever drawn.
News of the disaster reached Rome slowly at first, and then all at once, and the entire city was plunged into grief, with almost every family fearing a son, brother, or father had been lost in the fog beside that lake. Rome responded by appointing a careful, patient statesman named Fabius Maximus, who refused to give Hannibal the open battle he wanted, choosing instead to shadow him, cut his supplies, and simply wait him out, even as his own countrymen mocked him for cowardice. That painful lesson from Trasimene, learned through 15,000 drowned soldiers, eventually became the very strategy that saved the Republic, and years later brought down Hannibal's own homeland for good.
Today, the shores of Lake Trasimene are quiet, green, and almost impossible to connect with the horror that unfolded there so many centuries ago. But that quiet is exactly what makes the story worth remembering, because it proves something that still holds true far beyond ancient battlefields. Victory rarely belongs to whoever has the most strength or the largest numbers standing behind them. It belongs to whoever understands their opponent so completely that the outcome is already settled before the real fighting even begins.